Britain's censors weren't just cutting frames in the 1,970 seconds. They were at war with a whole new wave of movies that felt too raw, too wild, and too unpolished for polite society. Directors pushed limits, critics screamed, and local councils slammed doors shut, but the reels survived, whispered about, passed around, and watched in secret. How far could cinema go before the scissors came out? Let's look at the films they tried to bury but couldn't erase. The Devil's 1971. If there's one title that defines the phrase banned in Britain, it's Ken Russell's The Devils. Imagine a film so bold that even its studio tried to disown it. Set in 17th century France, it tells the story of a priest under fire from both church and state. But this wasn't a dry history lesson. Oliver Reed plays Father Grandier with a mix of defiance and tragedy, while Vanessa Redgrave delivers one of the strangest and most intense performances of the decade. The film's design hit just as hard as its performances. Derek Jarman built massive white sets that looked more like a nightmare stage play than a period film. Every frame felt stylized, stripped down, and harsh. Russell wasn't aiming for realism. He was aiming for impact. And that's exactly what got him in trouble. The British Board of Film Classification hacked away at it, cutting scenes they felt went too far. Local councils didn't even bother with cuts. They banned it altogether. Warner Brothers, the studio behind it, made things worse. Instead of fighting for the director's vision, they buried the uncut version. For decades, fans traded grainy copies, each missing a different piece. You never knew which version you were getting. Even now, a fully restored cut has never been officially released in the UK. What makes The Devil stand out isn't shock value for its own sake. It's the way it turns power struggles into performance, with authority figures using pageantry as a weapon. Watching it today, you realize it's less about history and more about control, and that sting hasn't faded in 50 years. The Devils remains one of the most censored, most argued about, and most unforgettable films Britain ever produced. Virgin Witch 1972. The title alone practically dared the British censors to ban it. Virgin Witch wasn't subtle about what it was selling. Two sisters chasing modeling careers who stumble into a countryside house filled with strange rituals and eerie ceremonies. On paper, it sounded like lightweight exploitation, the kind of film you'd expect to vanish after a late-night screening. Instead, it became a flashpoint. When the British Board of Film Classification saw it, their response was swift, rejected outright. No certificate, no nationwide release. Only a handful of councils allowed it to screen, often with heavy trimming. Yet, the rejection only built its legend. Viewers who managed to track it down found something that was more atmospheric than expected. Everyone on screen played it straight, never winking at the audience, which gave it an odd seriousness. The film leans into dreamlike imagery, candlelit ceremonies, whispered vows, figures in cloaks moving through old stone halls. It's less about scares and more about mood. That's exactly what kept it alive in underground circles. Home taping fans passed copies hand to hand, making it a cult item long after its short-lived cinema run. What really rattled the censors was the mix of glamour and the uncanny. Britain in the early 70s was nervous about films that blurred the line between glossy fantasy and darker themes. Virgin Witch refused to pick a side. It felt both cheap and oddly committed, like it wanted to be taken seriously even as it strutted into taboo territory. Today, it looks more camp than dangerous. But back then, it landed on the wrong desk at the wrong time. Virgin Witch didn't just earn its ban, it wore it like a badge. Proof that sometimes the quickest way to cult status is being told you can't be seen. Deathline 1972. Picture yourself on the last train home, the tunnels of the London Underground echoing with silence. Now imagine something waiting down there. Not rats, not shadows, something human, but broken. That's the premise of Deathline, released in America as raw meat. It might sound like a monster movie, but what director Gary Sherman delivered was far more unsettling. A story soaked in rot, starvation, and decay. The setup is brilliantly simple. Decades earlier, a group of Victorian laborers was trapped underground during construction. Generations later, only one survivor remains, feeding off unlucky passengers. He barely speaks, just mutters, "Mind the doors," over and over, a twisted echo of the underground itself. Instead of cheap shocks, Sherman fills the screen with silence, static shots, and claustrophobic corridors. The horror isn't just what the figure does, it's what he represents: abandonment, survival, and the people society literally left underground. Donald Pleasance steals the film as a grumpy, cigarette-stained inspector. He plays it like he's in a kitchen sink drama rather than a horror movie, which makes the terror feel even more real. Christopher Lee even shows up for a cameo, delivering icy authority in just one scene. The British censors trimmed it, not because of gore, but because of tone. The BBFC wasn't used to horror that felt this bleak. Local councils followed suit, yanking screenings or slapping restrictions on it. Without a clear villain, without fast pacing, it unnerved audiences in ways traditional horror never did. Decades later, it's still one of the most atmospheric exploitation films Britain ever made. Deathline isn't loud. It's slow, suffocating, and unforgettable. The kind of film that changes the way you hear the phrase, "mind the doors," next time you ride the tube. House of Whipcord 1974. Pete Walker wasn't subtle, and House of Whipcord proves it. This isn't a haunted house story. It's a prison dressed as a mansion, run by zealots who believe punishment is justice. A runaway model wanders inside, only to discover she's now a prisoner, sentenced by self-appointed guardians who never let their victims go. What makes it chilling isn't gore or jump scares. It's the calmness. The wardens don't shout, they don't laugh, they deliver punishments like it's an afternoon chore, which makes every scene land harder. Whipcord's theme is control, the kind that hides behind tradition and politeness until it snaps into cruelty. The BBFC hacked away at the film, stripping down the most explicit moments, but the cuts didn't make it safe. In fact, the stripped version felt even harsher, because it left only the cold discipline and grim faces. Local councils didn't wait. From Manchester to Bournemouth, screenings were pulled after a weekend. Some theaters yanked it mid-run, and yet audiences kept finding it. Bootleg tapes, word of mouth, midnight screenings, House of Whipcord refused to vanish. Critics called it tasteless, but fans recognized it as something else. A raw indictment of hypocrisy dressed as horror. Looking back, the film feels like a dare. It punishes the viewer as much as the characters, daring you to sit through another minute. Walker knew exactly what he was doing, making you squirm, not with splatter, but with suffocating authority. That's why it still lingers, decades later. Frightmare 1974, an English cottage, rain outside, tea on the stove. It all looks ordinary, until you realize the sweet old woman at the center isn't baking biscuits. She's preparing her next victim. That's the slow gut punch of Frightmare, another Pete Walker film, and one that cemented his reputation as Britain's king of exploitation horror. The brilliance of Frightmare is how normal it all looks. The violence doesn't happen in castles or dungeons. It happens in a living room, with the television, glowing in the background. Sheila Keith plays the old woman with unnerving warmth, smiling even as she does unspeakable things. You're left wondering how much the rest of her family knows, or how much they're willing to ignore. The BBFC zeroed in on the infamous drill scene, slicing it down heavily. But even the trimmed version rattled audiences. Campaigners demanded a full ban, and for years uncut VHS copies became prized possessions traded at horror marathons. Watching the raw version felt like holding contraband. What keeps Frightmare alive isn't the gore, it's the collision of domestic calm with sudden menace. Walker knew the true terror wasn't shadows in the woods. It was sitting across the table from someone smiling, as if everything was fine. Critics sneered, labeling it nasty, but fans knew better. Frightmare proved that British horror could stand toe-to-toe with anything coming out of Italy or America at the time. It's a film that makes you look twice at quiet cottages and wonder what secrets they're hiding. One of Walker's finest, and one that earned every bit of its infamy. Exposé 1976. Also known as The House on Straw Hill, this one didn't just raise eyebrows, it raised court cases. Exposé is the only British-made film ever dragged into the infamous video nasties panic of the 1,980 seconds. For something shot on a small budget in a country cottage, that's a strange legacy, but it shows how deeply the movie got under people's skin. The story follows Paul, a troubled writer played by Udo Kier, who retreats to the countryside to finish his novel. He hires a secretary, played by Linda Hayden, to help. At first, it feels like a slow-burn character study, a battle of wills between an arrogant author and a quiet but unpredictable guest. But underneath, the film drips with tension. Paranoia seeps in, trust turns to suspicion, small conflicts twist into violence. The British Board of Film Classification wasn't impressed. They hacked entire reels. Even the cut-down version rattled authorities enough to spark raids on video shops in the 1,980 seconds. Simply carrying an uncut tape was enough to bring the police through the door. Unlike imported grindhouse fare, this was homegrown. That made it sting. It felt uncomfortably close. Bootleggers kept it alive, and in underground circles, exposé became a badge of honor. Watching it wasn't just entertainment, it was rebellion against the rules. The film itself isn't flashy, it's moody, slow, even awkward at times. But that's what makes it effective. It isn't trying to thrill, it's trying to unsettle, leaving you unsure who is victim and who is predator. Today, it plays more like a psychological thriller than an outright horror film. But its reputation as Britain's only prosecuted nasty has secured its spot in exploitation history. A cottage, a typewriter, and a whole lot of unease. Prey 1977. Some movies scream their intentions from the start. Prey whispers. It begins in a quiet country house with two women already navigating a fragile relationship. Then a man stumbles in from the woods, claiming to be lost. But he isn't just lost, he isn't even human. Barry Stokes plays the stranger with a twitchy, animal energy, as if he's studying how to act like one of us, but never quite getting it right. Director Norman J. Warren could have gone the obvious route, loud scares, flashy effects, but instead, he keeps it small and strange. No musical cues to guide you, no comic relief to soften the blows. Just long silences, uncomfortable glances, and the creeping realization that you're watching something private, something you shouldn't be seeing. The tension comes less from the alien angle and more from the triangle it creates. The two women, played by Sally Faulkner and Glory Annan, hold the story together. Their dynamic gives the film its charge, and the intruder doesn't just threaten them physically, he throws their entire relationship into chaos. The BBFC trimmed a few moments, but the bigger problem was the atmosphere. Critics bristled at its quiet blend of intimacy and violence, accusing it of stepping over lines polite cinema wasn't supposed to cross. Audiences didn't flock to it, but those who found it never forgot it. At only 78 minutes, Prey doesn't waste a second. It's chilly, tense, and uncomfortable, the kind of film you watch with a knot in your stomach. It's not about big scares. It's about dread, and that dread lingers long after the credits roll. Killer's Moon 1978. If House of Whipcord was a dare, Killer's Moon was a full-on hallucination. At first, it looks harmless. A busload of schoolgirls breaks down in the Lake District. Then, 4 men appear from the woods. They're escaped patients from a local asylum, convinced they're dreaming and free to do whatever they want. The result is one of the strangest exploitation films Britain ever produced. Director Alan Birkinshaw shot it fast and cheap, and it shows. Scenes jump from almost documentary calm to surreal bursts of menace. Violence arrives without warning, sometimes scored against upbeat music, which makes it all the more disturbing. It doesn't feel like a polished film. It feels like a bad dream you can't shake. Teachers' groups and parents' organizations erupted in outrage when the film circulated. Local councils pulled it from cinemas after brief runs. The BBFC snipped heavily, but even the trimmed version carried a jagged, unpredictable energy. For many, it wasn't the content alone, but the offhand way it unfolded that made it so alarming. Like many exploitation titles, it survived through VHS tapes traded late at night. Over time, that raw, awkward energy turned it into a cult classic. Fans praised it for its sheer nerve, how it refused to follow rules, how it left you constantly off balance. Killer's Moon isn't comfortable, it isn't neat. It's clumsy, harsh, and unforgettable. The kind of film that proves sometimes the rough edges are what stick with you. Scum 1979. Few British films hit harder than Scum. Alan Clarke originally shot it in 1977 as a BBC television play, but the network pulled it before broadcast, declaring it too brutal for screens. Clarke didn't let it die. He remade it in 1979 as a theatrical release, and what audiences saw was one of the rawest depictions of life inside a Borstal, Britain's juvenile prison system. There's no sugarcoating here. Ray Winstone, in one of his earliest and most defining roles, plays Carlin, a quiet but coiled figure who quickly learns that survival depends on violence. The film doesn't hide the system's ugliness. Racism, bullying, relentless brutality, it's all captured without gloss or sentimentality. The camera doesn't look away. There's no soundtrack to soften the blows, no narration to tell you how to feel. Just cold, harsh reality. The reaction was explosive. The British Board of Film Classification demanded cuts, but even the trimmed version drew protests. Members of Parliament called for national bans, newspapers attacked it as corrupting, and Clarke was accused of exploiting suffering for shock value. Yet, for others, that rawness was the point. Scum wasn't making things up, it was exposing them. Bootleg VHS tapes carried the uncut version to audiences who wanted the full story. Decades later, the film is studied as a landmark in British cinema. It's not pleasant, it's not comforting, but it is unforgettable, a film that forced Britain to confront a system many wanted to ignore. Scum wasn't just banned. It was fought over in courts, in Parliament, and in the press, and that's why it endures. Straw Dogs, 1971. Sam Peckinpah may have been an outsider to Britain, but with Straw Dogs, he carved his mark deep into the country's cinematic history. The film stars Dustin Hoffman as David, a mild-mannered American academic who moves with his young wife, played by Susan, George, to a small Cornish village. What looks at first like a quiet retreat quickly turns sour as the locals grow increasingly hostile. Tension mounts, and what begins as unease escalates into an eruption no one forgets. What set Straw Dogs apart was never blood or gore. It was the discomfort. Peckinpah specialized in slow burns, and here he took it to the extreme. Hoffman's character, initially soft-spoken and measured, is gradually pushed into a corner. Scene by scene, civility is stripped away until only raw instinct remains. By the time the climactic siege explodes at his farmhouse, the transformation is complete. It's a finale that leaves you unsettled long after the credits. The British Board of Film Classification didn't know how to handle it. For years, they zeroed in on specific sequences, cutting or rejecting the film entirely. At different times, Straw Dogs was banned outright, pulled from shelves, and kept out of circulation. Yet, fans still found ways to see it. Imported tapes and bootlegs circulated quietly, sparking endless debates. Was Peckinpah holding up a mirror to society's darker impulses, or was he exploiting them? Critics were split, audiences shaken. When the fully uncut version finally appeared in the UK in 2002, decades after its debut, the arguments reignited. But one truth was undeniable. Straw Dogs hadn't lost its sting. It still stood as one of cinema's most disturbing portrayals of pressure, power, and breaking points. A film you might despise, but one you cannot ignore. The Confessions films, 1974, 1978. Not every banned or censored film came wrapped in horror or heavy drama. Sometimes, it was comedy that caused the most noise. The Confessions series, beginning with Confessions of a Window Cleaner in 1974, was Britain's answer to cheeky American comedies, and it sparked more trouble than anyone expected. The formula was simple: an ordinary man stumbling through one misadventure after another, always landing in awkward situations. The tone was light, silly, and rarely threatening. But what critics saw was something else entirely. To them, these films were proof that Britain's standards were slipping. Councils refused screenings, newspapers blasted them as trashy, and campaigners tried to have them yanked off shelves altogether. What makes their story fascinating is how well they did despite the fury. Audiences flocked to every new release, filling cinemas and proving there was a market for humor that poked fun at everyday life while towing the line of decency. The British Board of Film Classification stepped in with trims, and local councils pushed bans, but the laughter in theaters never stopped. Today, the series feels less dangerous than it did in the 70s. Watch them now, and they play like time capsules, snapshots of a Britain torn between 60s-style freedom and a return to stricter conservatism. Critics never relented, but audiences kept showing up. That gap between outrage and popularity was exactly why the debate stayed alive for years. The Confessions films weren't brutal, They weren't shocking in the traditional sense, but they managed something rarer. They turned comedy into controversy. Proof that sometimes a joke can cause just as much trouble as a scream. The Sinful Dwarf, 1973. Not every band in Britain tale came from inside its borders. The Sinful Dwarf was a Danish-British co-production that slipped briefly into cinemas before being yanked into obscurity. Almost instantly, it disappeared under bans, seizures, and whispers. For years, people heard about it more than they ever actually saw it. That's often the way legends are born. The setup is deceptively simple, a rundown boarding house hiding darker secrets. What unfolded on screen felt stranger and more unsettling than its budget could justify. The sets looked grimy, the atmosphere claustrophobic, and the characters carried an uncomfortable edge that made the entire film feel wrong in a way you couldn't quite shake. Even when nothing shocking happened, the mood made you uneasy. The British Board of Film Classification wasn't having it. They rejected it outright, and many local councils refused to even consider screenings. The film's short cinema life ended almost as quickly as it began. What survived were battered VHS copies traded in underground circles, often incomplete, grainy, and sometimes missing entire sections. That scarcity only added to the mystique. Then, in the 2000s, cleaned-up restorations surfaced, giving modern audiences a chance to finally see the full film. What they found wasn't a hidden masterpiece, but it was something else entirely, a bizarre and uncomfortable slice of exploitation that leaned into its grime until it became unforgettable. Its offbeat performances and strange tone gave it a place in cult history. The Sinful Dwarf never reached mainstream viewers, and maybe it never could, but in the underground, it became a badge of honor. Proof that sometimes the films that vanish quickest, the ones cut down before they can grow, are the ones people end up talking about the longest. From country houses turned prisons to underground tunnels filled with dread, these 12 films prove one thing. The harder Britain tried to bury them, the stronger their legends grew. Censors cut, councils banned, and studios buried, but audiences always found a way. Which of these forgotten rebels have you seen, or do you dare to watch? Let us know in the comments, subscribe for more hidden film history, and remember, cinema's shadows are often the hardest to erase.